Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Ellen Wilson, and I'll be the moderator for this expert briefing for the media, which is hosted by the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Today's experts will address gun violence prevention. Topics will include firearm-related cases now before the U.S. Supreme Court, policies that help prevent gun violence, including emergency risk protection orders, known as red flag laws, and firearm purchaser licensing laws, and how to address the threat of firearms in domestic political spaces and armed insurrections. I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers. Cassandra Crifasi is co-director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions and an associate professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Joshua Horwitz is co-director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions. He is also the inaugural Dana Feitler Distinguished Professor of the Practice in Gun Violence Prevention and Advocacy in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. We will have time for questions following our speakers' remarks. We will take some questions that have been submitted in advance of the briefing and some from the Zoom chat. If you have a question, please enter it in the Zoom chat addressed to panelists and hosts. Please enter your name, media outlet in question. We hope to cover as many as possible. Please note that participants are welcome to use images, video, or quotes directly from the briefing, and that the content is for immediate release. Participants will be muted during this briefing and it will be recorded. Cass, please go ahead.
Thanks, Ellen, and welcome everyone for being here today. I want to start off by acknowledging that gun violence, injury, and deaths is a complex issue. That's why it's so important that we take a public health approach. There's no one policy, no one program that will solve this issue, but we do know that there are several effective policies that can address multiple forms of gun violence. We also know that firearm laws work best when they are used together, with comprehensive background checks really serving as a foundation to ensure all of our other laws work better, making sure that minimum age laws or domestic violence protection orders are found through background checks prior to sales. But research from our center shows that firearm purchaser licensing, sometimes referred to as permit to purchase, that includes an application processed by law enforcement, a more thorough background check that uses fingerprints and has access to more records, as well as more time for law enforcement to complete that check, is a really important life-saving policy. These laws, these systems also have a built-in waiting period, particularly for first-time gun purchasers, that might delay an impulsive purchase that someone could use to harm themselves or others. And this effective system to check people's backgrounds, to identify and screen out those who shouldn't have firearms, whether that's because of a criminal history, youthful age, or some other issue, is a really important foundation, again, for all of our other laws to work. I will note that there was a recent Fourth Circuit case striking down Maryland's handgun qualification license. We anticipate that will be appealed successfully, given the long-standing tradition in the U.S. of prohibiting gun ownership by dangerous individuals. The second topic that I wanted to touch on briefly is guns in public. We have several new studies from our center showing that when you make it easier for people to carry concealed firearms in public, that's harmful to public safety. And this comes in the wake of many states being forced to change the way they are regulating concealed carry after last summer's Supreme Court decision in the Bruen case. And in that case, the court struck down the discretionary element of New York's concealed carry law, but it also introduced a requirement to use text, history, and tradition in determining the constitutionality of contemporary laws. As a result, we've really been focused on objective criteria, removing the subjective discretion and focusing on objective factors like requiring live fire training or prohibiting people who have a violent misdemeanor conviction from getting a concealed carry license. And these are two objective steps that can help minimize or mitigate some of the harms we might otherwise see when states make it easier for people to carry guns in public, concealed guns in particular. In addition to these two policies being effective, many regulations, in particular around civilian concealed carry, are supported by large portions of US adults. For example, in our most recent 2023 public opinion polling survey, more than 70% of adults said that they think that if you want a concealed carry license, you should have to pass a test. And 68% supported prohibiting people from bringing guns into government buildings. And I'll end my remarks right now by noting that both who can purchase firearms and the systems around those purchases and where they can carry them are important considerations when we're thinking about things like our citizens' capacity to engage in the democratic process, like getting out to vote. And I'll pause there for now.
Thank you, Cass. Now we will hear from Josh. Josh, please go ahead.
Well, thank you, and thank you for everybody for being here. Cass mentioned the Bruin case, and now we're seeing the effects of it in real time. There's a long-standing federal law that prohibits people subject to domestic violence protective orders from possessing firearms. Recently, a federal court in the Fifth Circuit, in the case of United States versus Rahimi, found that these types of firearms prohibitions based on protective orders were unconstitutional because they did not meet the Bruin standard. On appeal, the Supreme Court is now considering whether that prohibition is constitutional. Rahimi argued that there was no domestic violence firearm prohibitions at the time of the founding, so he should be able to keep his guns. We disagree with that. There's always been laws to prevent dangerous people from owning weapons, and this situation is no different. In response to the appeal to the Supreme Court, members of our center drafted and filed a definitive public health brief arguing that there's plenty of evidence showing that people subject to a protective order are at risk of violence. In oral arguments last month, the justices seemed poised to overturn the Fifth Circuit decision, and we are cautiously optimistic. But no matter the outcome of Rahimi, the court's decision in Bruin is still putting our nation's gun laws at risk. For instance, as Cass mentioned, just 2 weeks ago, a 3-judge panel of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals struck down Maryland's handgun purchaser licensing law based on the Bruin case. This already is on appeal to the full Fourth Circuit, but it is clear that Bruin has opened new challenges to laws that protect public health, and we will see more litigation in the future. Okay, so my next subject. As we approach the anniversary of the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, I want to discuss a new report that we just published called Defending Democracy. We have a list of recommendations to protect the integrity of the nation's democratic processes. First, states and local governments need to regulate the public carry of firearms, both opened and concealed. Second, we need to strengthen and enforce laws to prohibit paramilitary activity. Unlawful militias should not be tolerated in our democratic society. Third, we need to allow local governments to prohibit possession of firearms in locations essential to political participation, like polling places and legislative buildings. Fourth, leaders should break the insurrectionist permission structure by openly denouncing political violence. And lastly, for our recommendations, enact and implement extreme risk protection order laws, also known as red flag laws, to temporarily disarm people who pose a high risk of violence. Extreme risk laws have already been issued by courts to temporarily remove firearms from members of armed white supremacist groups who have made threats of interpersonal violence, and we encourage that use. And for my last point, and there's been a lot of discussion about Maine's, the mass shooting in Maine. There's been a discussion between the difference between red flag laws and Maine's yellow flag law. Maine's law, the yellow flag law as they call it, is much more cumbersome than a typical red flag law and requires that a potential respondent both be in custody and be subject to a mental health evaluation before a firearm prohibition can be enforced. So I'm going to stop there and we'll welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Josh. We will take questions now, and if you have one, please enter it in the Zoom chat with your name, media outlet, question, and to whom you'd like to address your question. Let's kick off with a question from Mike Zamora at Scripps News. Please explain your center's efforts to pioneer gun violence prevention policies. Specifically, how do we prevent the next, and Cass, I'll turn to you on this, school shooting, mall shooting, movie theater shooting, bar shooting, place of worship shooting?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the important things that we do in our center is not just generate research on whether policies are effective or not. We also generate the implementation best practices and go out and train people how to use these policies. So very specifically thinking about mass shootings and other forms of violence, our center, which Josh co-leads with our colleague, Dr. Shannon Frateroli, is the National Extreme Risk Protection Order Training and Technical Assistance Center. So policies like extreme risk protection orders are really effective when law enforcement has this as a tool to think about reducing violence. Often individuals who are thinking about perpetrating a mass shooting, they leak that information. They let people know through some way that might happen. And having this tool to intervene before violence occurs is really important. And that's a nice complement to making sure that we're screening out people on the front end through robust background check systems. And both of these policies complement each other and are important to reducing violence.
Thank you so much. And Josh, please explain your center's efforts to prevent the next insurrection.
Look, we think it's extremely important that we focus on two pieces of this. First of all, the sort of the rhetoric that we talk about, the idea that the Second Amendment somehow allows an individual right for insurrection. It does not. So we educate about that. And we think it's important both for elected leaders and for the media, people here, to call out when they hear that sort of the individual's right to take on tyranny with a firearm. That's incorrect. The Supreme Court has never said that. That's not in our history. Second, we need to look at the role of firearms. Firearms makes this violence lethal, and we must disconnect the firearm from these activities that are meant to intimidate and threaten elected leaders, people tallying ballots, people exercising their democratic rights, which is why in this report, we really focus on making these places safe by limiting public carry of firearms in places where people are exercising their democratic rights.
Great, thank you both. Here's a question from Amanda Pampuro at Courthouse News in Denver. And if you could each take this, we'll start with you, Cass. How do we measure whether our gun violence prevention policies are working?
That's such a great question. One of the hardest things in public health is to prove when things don't happen, right? If we're doing our job, we're intervening and we're preventing, often things are not happening. But there are ways that we can assess whether policies and programs are working, and that's by comparing to other places that don't have the policy, but also looking at various outcomes. So some of the policies that we're interested in might reduce suicide, homicide, mass shootings, but sometimes those are very downstream factors that might take a long time. And so we might look a little more upstream. Where are guns moving in underground markets? What are the perceptions about gun availability from people who might be trying to acquire them unlawfully? And really thinking about how guns are moving. Are people following sales laws? Are they undergoing background checks? We really try to look at the various outcomes that we might use to try to assess whether these policies and programs are working, really thinking about both quantitative and qualitative data. Josh?
Well, I would just say, as someone who's been involved in advocacy most of my career, working at the center is a unique and incredible experience. We focus on objective and nonpartisan research. And when we go out and talk to legislators, and we talk to the media, we're bringing that information with us, and we're doing a lot of it from what we've actually either our researchers have developed themselves, some of the public opinion polling that Cass has directed. So we're really trying to pull these pieces together, and our center focuses on this type of research and putting it in the hands of decision makers. And that's kind of our methodology and how we approach this.
Thank you so much. Josh, we'll start with you on the next question, which will be for both speakers. It's from Jessica Albert with WJZ. Can you apply how some of these gun policies could help reduce violence in cities like Baltimore and tragedies like the one that happened at UNLV yesterday?
Well, I think we can't stop all of these tragedies, unfortunately. And as Cass mentioned, it's hard to quantify what doesn't happen. But we know from a lot of the work that we're doing, especially when I look at the work I do on extreme risk protection orders, you're looking at these petitions every single day, and you're seeing the mass shootings that are prevented. You're seeing the suicides that are prevented, and they often don't make the news. But when we think about many of these shootings, like we think about the shooting in UNLV, we don't know whether there were warning signs there or not. But the policies that we're working on, for instance, for the extreme risk law, and for instance, our firearm purchaser licensing, we can tell from the data that we are really reducing shootings. And so, it's unfortunate we can't stop everything, but our data is showing that we're making a difference with the policies that we develop. And we know from our licensing laws, you can compare laws from states like Connecticut that enacted licensing laws and Missouri that got rid of their licensing laws. You're seeing dramatic swings in death and shooting deaths in those states, and saving lives in Connecticut. And when Missouri repealed their statute, you saw an increase in death. So we're looking at those types of analysis. And also our new studies on extreme risk laws are starting to show real two things. One, we're seeing an impact on suicide, and we're also seeing an impact on mass shootings. So unfortunately, we can't stop everything, but we do think the policies that we really lean into, that we spend our time on, are saving lives every day. And I'll then turn it to Cass.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica, for this question. One thing I will acknowledge is that states with strong gun laws are at the mercy of states with weak gun laws around them. So Maryland has firearm purchaser licensing, handgun qualification license, which, as we mentioned, has been challenged. But we have assessed not just outcomes in Maryland in terms of homicide and suicide, but we've spoken with people in the underground gun market in Baltimore. We've looked at where guns are coming from that are recovered in crime in Baltimore City. And we find that the majority of guns used in crime in Baltimore and in Maryland don't originate in Maryland. They're coming from Tennessee, West Virginia, before they strengthened their laws. And so we have made an impact on in-state availability of guns for use in crime. Unfortunately, we also then need to take a regional approach to be encouraging our neighbor states to take these same policy actions so that we can reduce the trafficking of guns from those states into places like Baltimore. As a complement to that, we need to continue investing in communities that have been historically disadvantaged and disenfranchised to make sure that we can address the demand for firearms while we're also focused on addressing the supply side.
Great, thank you so much. Here's a question from Kate Ryan at WTOP. What impact does social media have? We've seen cases where texting between young people appear to have fueled violence. Is that something your analysis shows? And I can start with you, Cass, and then turn to you, Josh.
We certainly hear from the community violence intervention programs that we work with, as well as our law enforcement partners, that social media plays a really important role in initiating disputes, perpetuating disputes, and then those spilling over into sort of real world interactions. Our research does not very specifically look at the role of social media, but we hear over and over from our partners that our programs and our policies really need to be innovative to address the role of social media, music, SoundCloud, all those sorts of things, YouTube, where people can sort of have grudges start and then have those spill out into these real world interactions and lead to violence and death.
And the other place social media needs to be really understood, and we're working on that now, is looking at how social media influences the sale of firearms, how social media influences the carrying of firearms. Our partners our friends at Sandy Hook Promise recently had a study that came out yesterday looking at what happens when you simulate, for instance, a 13-year-old boy looking at social media and how much influence they get, how many advertisements they get to purchase firearms. So social media plays a role in disputes, but also in perpetuating the transactions in firearms and the sales of firearms. So there's a lot to be understood, and we're just starting to pull back the cover on some of that.
Great, thank you so much. Here's a question from Ted Oberg at News 4 Washington. Is there a state that is getting gun violence prevention right and preparing for political violence as we go into an election year? And I'll start with you, Cass, and then move to you, Josh.
Sure. So we do see unfortunate gridlock at the federal level, although I do want to acknowledge the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that was passed last summer, which is the first really meaningful piece of federal legislation in 30 years. But we are seeing a lot more activity at the state level, and places like Oregon that recently passed their permit to purchase or firearm purchaser licensing law via ballot initiative last election. Delaware and Washington State are really primed. And so there are several states that are doing the right kinds of things. And actually, if you graph all of the states in the US by their rate of gun death, from the highest to the lowest, a very clear pattern emerges. States that are putting the right kinds of policies in place, firearm purchaser licensing to strengthen background checks, ERPO, waiting periods, minimum age laws, safe storage, those states have the lowest rates of gun deaths, and the states that are more gun friendly have the highest rates.
Great, thank you, Josh. Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
This is a local question from a reporter here in the region. I'll mention that a state like Virginia, for instance, just in the last administration, changed their laws to actually protect the democratic process. So now you can't bring a firearm to a polling location or to the state capitol. And someone who has lobbied that state capitol, it feels much better to be able to be in a building where people aren't rubbing up against or pushing, walking by you with firearms when you're trying to test that. The other thing is they've given local control back to governments, to local governments. So now local governments can prevent firearms in their legislative chambers, county councils, things like that. So there are definitely states that are moving in the right direction. If you're looking for states, it's mentioned, Cass said, that have a whole suite of policies. You can look at places like California, you can, things like places like Massachusetts, but there are a number of states that have really put this together in meaningful ways. And, and also interestingly, there are states that are moving in the right direction that I never thought possible when I started. So states, for instance, like Colorado and Cass mentioned Oregon, these are states that were very difficult to work in this field early in the even 10 years ago or 5 years ago, but change is really in the air. So while federally it's very difficult, although we do have the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, on a state-by-state basis, we're really seeing change in this country, and it's exciting and important for saving lives and safeguarding our democratic process.
Great. Another question for you, Josh, and Cass, feel free to also add in. In some cases, states have ERPO red flag laws, but either people do not know about these laws or law enforcement does not enforce them. How can we improve the use of these around the country, the enforcement?
Well, as Cass mentioned, we have a Training Technical Assistance Center where we train people on how to implement ERPO, and there's extreme risk laws. There's so much work that needs to be done, but we're developing great resources. I encourage anybody to contact us who wants training, but there's also some excellent jurisdictions around the country who serve as models. So County, Fort Lauderdale are doing really good jobs with this. The other thing I encourage states is there's resources available in the Safer Communities Act. Take those resources, use those resources to do the training, because for the first time, the federal government has made those resources available. So we need a lot more implementation efforts here at Johns Hopkins, we're leading those, but there's lots of other opportunities to engage as well. And you got to have every state, every county needs a champion who's going to say, I'm going to take this, I'm going to help lead the training, and we're here to support those people.
I would just tack on to Josh's comment that one area of research that we do in the center is understanding the sort of Second Amendment preservation ordinances, laws, policies that states and jurisdictions are putting into place. Missouri, for example, has a Second Amendment Preservation Act that has been struck down. Ohio is considering something similar. And there are more than 1,300 local, city, county jurisdictions across the US that have passed these kinds of policies that really say, we affirm the Second Amendment and we're really not going to partner with federal law enforcement to enforce these laws. And so it's important to understand these perspectives so that when we are doing training, when we're doing dissemination, we can be prepared to have these conversations and help folks understand what these laws really are and counteract some of the myths about what they're not. So that's another important piece of the work that we're doing.
Great, Cass, let's start with you on this next one. How can gun violence prevention efforts bridge the bipartisan divide?
It's a great question. You know, when you look at solutions to this problem, as I mentioned, there are many evidence-based policies that are effective at addressing multiple forms of violence. And these policies are supported by the majority of US adults, many of them by the majority of gun owners as well, and Republicans. And so I think what I find to be the most effective strategy is focusing on those areas of agreement. Where is there a strong evidence base? Where do we see broad public support? And what are the misconceptions or where are there opportunities to educate people, particularly folks in the middle, where we may be able to give folks the information that they need to make an informed decision, contact a legislator, vote in a particular way, or even take an individual action, like more safely and securely storing their own firearms or having conversations with family and friends about the importance of safe and secure gun storage. So it's really about focusing on what we call in public health a harm reduction approach, just like we would with people who use drugs or people who work as sex workers. What can we do to minimize some of the risks of having a firearm in the home, not to take people's guns away, but to remind people about the responsibilities that come along with the rights of gun ownership.
Great, thank you. Josh, one for you.
Yeah.
What was different on January 6th from what we saw at the Michigan Capitol, where insurrectionists were openly carrying AR-15s at the state capitol? What can other states learn from that?
Well, I think, you know, on January 6th, the crowd, the mob there was, you know, hell-bent on violence. But I think if there definitely were firearms there at the Capitol, but if there's any good news at all on that, and it was a really bleak day for America, is that DC's laws prevented a lot of the firearms that could have been there. Obviously, there was not sort of the open carry of AR-15s. There was not that type of the types of other weapons that we've seen in protests in Richmond, Virginia, and Michigan. And, you know, in Michigan, the Capitol was actually taken over there. And so I think that when we think about our Defending Democracy report, it's imperative that states think about not just, we need to save as many lives as we can. Our centers work very hard on that, but also the link between firearms and democratic values and how we protect our elected officials, our democratic processes. And that requires us to make sure that our capitals, our legislative buildings, our polling locations are safe, and that the private use of firearms is not allowed in those places. One, because they can be dangerous, but two, because they can be intimidating. And it's incredibly important that we think states enact these types of local laws that protect the democratic process from threats of firearm violence.
Great, thank you. Last question for both of you, and we will start with you, Cass. What is your number one policy recommendation for improving gun violence prevention?
Great question. So if I could only get one policy, I would implement firearm purchaser licensing at the federal level. This is a law that's associated with fewer guns available for use in crime, lower rates of homicide, including mass shootings, lower rates of suicide, and lower rates of shootings by police and civilians shooting law enforcement. So that's a policy that addresses multiple forms of violence and helps us do a better job of identifying and screening out people we've already decided are too dangerous to own firearms.
Thank you. Josh.
I'll echo that, but I'll also say that our center, we have 5 policies that save lives. I encourage you to visit our website to see the 5 that we think will be most impactful, and including licensing. We also, of course, look at these extreme risk laws, domestic violence, firearm removal laws, and a number of other laws. But you have to make a choice sometimes. You put your resources into things that save lives, and at our center, we think that we've narrowed that down to a number of them that really do save lives, but it starts with firearm purchase or licensing.
Great. Thank you both for your presentations and incredibly insightful answers. And we will email the links to the resources mentioned today and share it in the chat. With that, I'd like to say thank you again to everyone for joining us today.
Thanks, Ellen.
Thank you.